You're listening to the 4th season of the Prophetic Imagination Station, Frank Peretti's America.
I'm DL Mayfield, a writer and neighbor.
And I'm Crispin Mayfield, a therapist.
Together, we like to overthink evangelical artifacts from the 80s and 90s.
This season, we're doing a deep dive into Frank Peretti's best-selling novel, This Present Darkness.
Thanks for listening.
So, last episode of Frank Peretti's America, last interview. We're going to do a wrap-up next time. But this is our last interview with Connie Baker.
Oh my gosh.
I know. It's great.
Crispin, I wasn't ready.
I told you it was good.
I wasn't ready for how incredible this was.
Yeah, it was really great.
So this is the only interview that you did on your own.
Mm-hmm.
You knocked it out of the park, bud. You did great.
Well, thanks. I was worried.
You did great.
I'm not much of a thinker on my feeder.
Well, you did great, but I gotta say, Connie Baker was incredible.
I know. I mean, that basically was the thing. Was like,
I'm pretty sure people who listen to our podcast and come from a similar sensibility of us, everybody's gonna just fall in love with Connie.
Mm-hmm.
She's a therapist. She's really experienced a lot and is able to delve into the topic, particularly around abuse in churches. So let's just throw that out there, right? Mm-hmm. There's going to be talk of abuse in this interview.
Right, yeah. Yeah, Connie talks about her own story. I talk a little bit about my story, which we'll talk about in our wrap-up episode. Mm-hmm. But yeah, for me, it was just so validating to hear Connie say, like, here's the way abusive systems work.
Yeah.
For me, it wasn't in church context, but it was my family. And there are all these spiritual dynamics when you come from a Christian family. So, like, just so much of this felt really familiar to me. And I think she just did a really great job of, like, framing, like, why do we have this response to hearing stories of abuse?
Yeah, and you guys didn't talk about This Present Darkness that much, mm-hmm. which is fine, because maybe all along this has really been a podcast about power. Uh-huh. And not exactly This Present Darkness alone. But yeah, I think it's really important for us to say even our fiction stories, really did focus on power.
Yeah, one thing that from the beginning I've really thought about, like, we've been talking about power and the politics, but this part obviously has been a huge part of the book. I thought Connie did a great job of tying those together, like the same dynamics that come up in abusive churches or abusive families, right, also play out on a national level. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is, are we willing to listen to, well, don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
But it all matters, and it truly is tied together. Mm-hmm. And so that's why a story of, like, a very niche best-selling Christian horror apocalyptic Pentecostal fiction novel, that's a lot, why it matters today, because it reveals a mindset, right? And it just mm-hmm. makes plain some of these narratives that are so troubling. And I mean, you guys talk a lot about some really current situations we've had, just with evangelical men being terrible and what she calls the good old boys club, rushing mm-hmm. to put them back into power. And so this remains incredibly relevant, and I wish it wasn't. I wish we weren't doing this podcast.
Right.
But we're doing it because of Bill freaking Hybels. I mean, there's so many more. I'm just going to say one mm-hmm. because we could be here all day. But yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I was wondering, so thinking about power and thinking about the narrative, especially in this book, where it's like the people that don't have much power are trying to take down the people that have a lot of power. And I was thinking about power dynamics and wondering for you, when you read scripture, when did you start paying attention to power dynamics in those stories? And what was that like for you as you started to, like, focus on that part?
Yeah, I don't know when that happened, but it's a pretty important jump to take, right? If you want to read the scriptures in a way where you're able to apply it to your actual life, is you will have to, at some point, Connie kind of talks about this, you need to actually look at your real life relationships through this lens of power and understanding there's mm-hmm. always a power differential happening. I think one thing that's hard is if you are like me and you come from the dominant culture perspective, you have a really hard time sometimes admitting to your own power. And I think white ladies are the worst at this, right? So like, because I'm a white lady, I can be like, oh my gosh, I'm a lady and I get, misogynized or whatever. But I'm unwilling to recognize like my power in other areas. And I don't think it's like a flat line, right? It changes all the time. And we need to take that approach to scripture too. Okay. What about you?
Yeah, I think it was in Minneapolis. I think that I started to, like, when we lived in Minneapolis, and I was learning a lot about my own privilege and power in systems and dynamics, and being encouraged by our community at that time to start looking at power dynamics in Scripture. Bob Ekblad talks a lot about that, which has been really encouraging, and looking at, like, who in the narrative has power, who doesn't.
Yeah, so Reading the Bible with the Damned is a great book. Just begin to look at that. But, reading scriptures or commentaries or theologians who have come from non-dominant culture backgrounds is obviously a great place to start, because oftentimes they will bring up the power dynamics right away. And that's how we learn, because dominant culture theologians don't tend to do that, in my experience. I do want to say really quickly, we're probably going to edit this out, but we are recording this during nap time, and we have had a small naked 4-year-old interrupt us twice, right?
Yes.
In the past 8 minutes of trying to record this intro.
Right. I told Danielle, I'm like, it's just 10 minutes. We just got to do a quick 10-minute intro. It will be fine.
How does that even happen?
It was not fine.
I don't want to ask why he needs new pants. Right? I'm worried. We need to go check that out.
I think I know why. So... One last thing, speaking of kids, we watched Touched by an Angel with our kids last weekend. They were only a little bit scared, and they could not figure out why the angels didn't look like angels. And then later we're like, why is there a light shining on their head? They need to turn off that light.
Yep. Yeah, but our daughter really liked it. We were going to watch it and tweet along, but not very many people tweeted along. That's okay. But I think we're going to pivot now and just keep thinking about these shows and maybe doing some other projects with them in the future. So we're not going to do a live tweet-a-thon anymore, because
it was a huge flop.
It was a failure, although we enjoyed ourselves immensely.
Yes.
And now our daughter wants to watch more Touched by an Angel, which I don't know how to feel about that.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not the worst, although...
No. It's kind of boring.
Yeah, quite boring.
Yeah. That's probably why she likes it.
Yeah, so I wanted to give you an update on that, but we would just love to continue to hear from you guys about this series. You can email us at propheticimaginationsstation@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at K__Mayfield on Twitter, and also at Prophetic Imagine without an E. And Danielle's on there
as Dio Mayfield. Yeah, if you get some questions to us real quick, we can probably talk about them as we do a wrap-up episode for Frank Peretti's America. It's been amazing having these conversations, seeing this go farther than we imagined, and we hope you enjoyed this interview with Connie Baker.
Tonight we have Connie Baker with us, actually, in our house, which is nice, rather than over the internet, like we've interviewed everyone else, because we go to church with Connie.
Oh, yes, good to be here.
But yeah, we're really glad. She is also a therapist, and specializes in religious trauma and abuse. Published a book last summer called Traumatized by Religious Abuse. And then you have some stuff on Facebook, so like communities on Facebook.
I do. I have a few options to connect there. I have a free group that actually just hit 500 people the last couple weeks. So that was pretty exciting. It's called Overcoming Religious Abuse Community, and it's on Facebook. And then I also just started a subscription group in the last month that is just going great, and for people who want to process their story.
That's so great. Yeah.
Religious trauma and that sort of thing. And then I also have a Facebook page that, people can check out. And my website, ConnieABaker.com. So, got a few things floating around.
Yeah, I always appreciate seeing stuff that you post on Facebook.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So in some previous interviews, we've talked a bit with people, touched on this theme within This Present Darkness, particularly about how demons possess women and then cause them to accuse falsely accuse men of sexual abuse or rape. Obviously, it's this is a heavy topic and just so problematic. And I think the first question actually that I have is, why do you think no one blinked an eye when this book was everywhere? Because you even told me that you read it and you
I did.
Right?
Oh gosh, yes. In my young adult years, I think I read it 2 or 3 times. That just aged me. Anyway, yes, I read it several times. I felt inspired by it, and I totally didn't even think twice about that at all. I didn't even think about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What was it about remembering reading the book? What was it like for you?
Well, what's interesting is I'm trying to remember what phase of life I read it at. Do you remember when it came out?
Yes, the year I was born.
Okay, what was it?
1986.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. 1986. So I read it. Interestingly, okay, so a little bit of my story will actually tie into this.
Great.
Because when I probably did blink an eye, because in high school I had been forcibly kissed by a pastor like 4 or 5 times when I was 16. So I was then, this was a few years after that, when it came out. So I probably did. I was aware that there were times in which pastors actually did. And that the same pastor had been, oh my goodness, it's such a story, had been previously dismissed from the pastorate for sexually abusing a foster daughter, and then came back 3 years later and was still sexually abusing people like me. And so I was aware this does happen, that pastors are not flawless,
Right.
But it is, Crispin, it is a comfortable, it is a much more comfortable place. There's so many dynamics here. For us to say that bad woman falsely accused a pastor, she was demonically influenced. And if there's an accusation, to come to that conclusion honestly, as a church, we breathe a sigh of relief. It is much easier than to say the head of this community has acted out in a damaging way with one of the parishioners, and the fabric begins to unravel in the community, because it's a threat to everyone if the pastor himself has not been ethical, has been immoral, has been outside of lines. This causes so much anxiety. We want our pastors to be upright. And it gives integrity to the whole community if that's the case. And all of us go, oh, it's kind of like, okay, Dad's really is a good human. The family can breathe a sigh of relief. But if Dad's not a good human, I mean, and there again, that's a little overstated. But if Dad is, quote, Dad, in quotes, if the pastor is acting out in that way, it makes it's devastating. It shakes us. And I think that narrative is much better for our anxiety. Oh, that bad woman, she falsely accused our good man, is so much easier for us.
Right.
There's just so many angles to this. And there's so many angles. I think, anyway, I can go on some others.
What else is coming to mind?
Well, the other thing that comes to mind is, okay, I'm a therapist, so I'm probably going to bring a dark side of humanity into this mix, but it's what I see in my office every day. So, and I actually still really like people, which is, kind of nice. And I actually tend to really believe the best in people, but what I know, I'm going to put this down in gender. Put it in gender categories. If you've got this scenario, the women breathe a sigh of relief because I'm so grateful. Dad isn't going to hurt me. Okay. The pastor now is not a threat to me. I'm kind of talking in family systems here, but
That's
the
wonderful.
pastor now isn't going to hurt me because that was that bad woman who falsely accused. Whew. Good. I can kind of retain my respect and appreciation for him and still feel close to him and safe with him. So it would threaten the women on that end. On the men have vested interest in it. Okay, this is going to sound bad. But because we know percentage-wise, evangelical men, that the percentage is very high with their usage of porn and their sexually acting out. So if that bad woman's accusing this good man, then it keeps things stable for them. They can say, all right, keep this thing under wraps. Let's not have a big exposure of somebody like this that make me feel uncomfortable. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I talking
yes,
language
definitely.
here? Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, I've been in situations like that in my own life where I was talking to another Christian man and I said, hey, this other person, like, we need to address this. They've sexually abused someone. And the person said, well, I have stuff that I know I don't want my wife to know.
Yes.
And so we need to keep that in mind.
Yes.
Right?
Stifle
and I'm like,
it. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, put this under wraps. Do not shut it up quick because I have a stake in this game. And that's really probably the best way to put this is a church community has a big stake in the game about whether their pastor, for multiple reasons, if their pastor has been acting out, it's devastating at multiple levels and everybody has a stake in it.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. Have you ever heard a story about someone being accused of being demon possessed?
You know, I don't think I've heard that one. I think it was probably the I'll put some denominations out here or some categories. I was raised non-Pentecostal, let's put it that way. And, that was always, looking, it was back in the olden days where, looking askance like, oh, Well, then I married an Assembly of God pastor, which I thought was hilarious. But anyways, but no, I wasn't raised around that language around demons was not par. It was not the norm. And so, no, I haven't heard of that. I mean, I've heard around about, but I've never been really directly involved with that.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Because I think it does have some denominational strains to it.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, that makes so much sense. I've talked on this podcast before about being a survivor of sexual abuse. So reading this for me, I was reminded of, I actually confronted my abuser. Wow. And he said, this just reminds me that Satan tries to bring down those that God is trying to use. Oh. Like, just by me bringing this up, he's like, well, God is trying to use me. And so you're being used by Satan by bringing this into the light. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And, Crispin, the second part of the story I didn't tell, which actually is a bigger part of my story, is I was sexually abused at 25 by a pastor for 9 months, then blamed by the church leadership and was required to give public confession and then dismissed from the church. So trauma out the wazoo for me as this young adult. And so, yes, now I read this book before that happened. So the timing of me reading this, because my abuse took place in 1990. Yeah. Okay, do the math. I'm 55. Anyway, so this took place in 1990. And I read this between, probably 2 or 3 times between 86 and 90. So, and I don't know, I think I was so traumatized and stunned. I may have read it once after the abuse and still didn't really give it a whole lot of thought. I mean, now I truly would read that and roll my eyes, and Crispin, let's just say this. It's not because pastors can't or men can't be falsely accused. That can happen. And it does. I'm going to say percentage-wise, it's super low because the woman has so much to lose by bringing any sexual assault up. She has so much to lose. But I guess I just want to say that. Of course, could this happen where a man is falsely accused? Yes. It's statistically low, but it can happen. Right. And so I think that's where we hold ourselves open and say, well, we don't want to believe it. We don't want to think it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's not only sexual abuse, but it's spiritual abuse, right? So how is spiritual abuse different than other types of abuse?
Oh, you're asking me questions I love to answer, Crispin.
Yeah.
Well, I think let's put this in a category. I think there's categories of spiritual or religious abuse. I use those terms interchangeably. So, under spiritual or religious abuse, there's about 5 major categories that I believe. One of them is psychological. Let's see if I can remember them all. Psychological, social, being ostracized. Sexual is one of them. Financial, and I'm forgetting a 5th one. Psychological. And then plain, purely spiritual in the sense of really twisting and damaging a person and controlling and manipulating their actual spiritual life. So those 5 ways. So to me, sexual abuse is only one piece of the pie. And even though that's my story, I'm really focused. What happened to me, the sexual abuse by the pastor when I was 25, I've always said probably caused 25% of the damage done to me. 75% was caused by the church leadership's reaction to what I went through. And the blaming, the publicity, the ostracizing was extremely devastating. Sexual abuse was left its own marks, and I've had to recover from that. But really, what I didn't have words for or didn't understand was how church, and here's my definition of religious abuse, is kind of what we're getting to, is where one person or institution has more power than an individual and leverages God or a religious idea to control another person, to manipulate, to silence, to weaken, to power play, to hurt another person. So it's the idea of a power differential, where somebody has more power and a pastor in that community has more power. That's why I do not believe in pastors having affairs. I believe it's sexual assault because of the power differential. So you've got a power differential, then you've got using and leveraging God to get that person to do what you want them to, and either to control them, manipulate, silence, weaken, any of those, hurt them. So that's the essence of religious abuse. And if you think about it, that happens a lot.
Yeah, what would be common examples of that outside of, abuse or sexual abuse being one example? What are other ways that you see that, or common ways? Right,
common ways. There are, I think about the messages that we hear, and by messages, I don't mean sermons, but the spoken and unspoken ideas that we hear. Things like, if you say there is a problem, you become the problem. So that's a big axiom in religious abuse. So, you talking to the pastor, you said there was a problem. You became the evil person that was being used by Satan. So if you say there's a problem, then you become the problem. In your case, it was you're being used by Satan to bring me down. But it could be you're too sensitive, you're a gossip, you are, whatever it is. And using you're not walking in the Spirit, using spiritual language to flip things and have that person become the problem. Threats of punishment or ostracization are also tools. In other words, this can be subtle. This can be subtle. We're having a big fund drive for our new building project. And okay, I'm going to go through the abusive language first and then say more appropriate. We're doing a fun drive. God is in this. God is blessing this. If you want God's blessing, you're going to get on board and give. Okay, leave it right there. I mean, sometimes it's taken further. Your finances are going to see problems if you don't. Now, a lot of pastors will stop before they say that. But you hear the implication. God's not going to bless unless I give my money. That's financial exploitation, leveraging God. Is it okay to give what you want to give to? Of course.
Right.
But but the appropriate, language is we believe the best of our ability that God's leading us this direction. We want you to, make your own decision before God about what you want to do to help this. We're trusting it's a good thing, but we're also trusting God to lead through you. That flattens the power differential. To say, here, it's a humble stance, an open-handed stance of saying, we believe this is where we want to go, but we're also trusting our congregation to support this if it's supposed to happen. So feel the difference in that?
Right, yeah, totally. I was thinking, the sexual abuse aside, the bigger narrative here in this book is if you are opposing the pastor, then you're opposing God.
Yes, that's a much bigger narrative. Yes, thank you. And especially bringing it back to Peretti's book.
Right.
That's exactly right. And that is in fact, I think one of the first messages in my book that I write about is do not question me or us in any way, or you'll be punished somehow by God or by us as his instruments. Now, are most pastors going to say those exact words? Likely no, although I have heard some. I mean, that's, oh my gosh.
Right.
But they're going to be much more subtle. They're going to be much more finessed about that. They're going to say, like you, oh, God's trying to bring me, Satan's trying to bring me down and, by you coming. And so it sounds really cloaked in this spiritual language. But basically it is, don't you question. Oh, I mean, how often have we heard the horribly misused verse, don't touch God's anointed? It's like, there it is.
Right, yeah.
Don't. In other words, do not question me. So now I have supreme authority and I'm the voice of God. And if you question me, you're questioning God and your spiritual walk isn't right. I mean, that's at the far end. It's not that far. That's cults.
Right, yeah.
It's like, oh, nasty. So these are some of the expressions, and that's there again. I've got a bunch of them, but those are probably some of the overarching ideas. Some of them about how this can look besides sexual abuse.
Right. Yeah. Danielle and I were talking about Bill Hybels, right, and we were talking about the women that were bringing these accusations, and we were talking about how likely in a setting like that, we don't know. But you probably don't need to make any threats, because the message all the time is, this is God's church, this is God's ministry.
Don't touch it.
Right. And so even for those women, it might even be like, I'm going to choose to not say anything because I don't want to mess up what God is doing. Because it's God's
ministry.
Right.
Correct. I am struck. I don't know, something, I know this to be true. It's part of my story. What I lost in that spiritual abuse was so vast. It took me about 10 years to recover, and partly because I didn't understand what I'd gone through. I finally started understanding the sexual assault, but I did not understand spiritual abuse, so I just floundered. And when that broke with Hybels, it struck me again how much those women had to lose. They had their jobs, their careers, their meaning, what they were pouring their life into. They had their social circle, their best friends. They didn't know who would stand by them. I'll guarantee that, because I've been there. You don't know who's going to stand by you, because nobody wants to see Bill Hybels taken down. And so the reaction is, how could you do this? God's working and you're screwing it up. So then they have their own conscience about, oh my goodness, what if I'm wrecking God's work? They're losing their identity as this upstanding church member. They're losing their reputation. I mean, it is so vast. And I can say that with certainty. These are women who worked in this huge church and were high up in the organization. I'll guarantee that those things, I mean, I'd be shocked if one of those wasn't true of those women.
Right.
It's almost like, how could it not be? And I just look at that and I think that is why our chosen narrative of Satan's using that woman to bring a pastor down is can be so crazy making. It's like, do you hear what you're saying? Do you see what this woman is going to lose by talking? Oh,
right. Yeah. And so knowing that all these dynamics exist, right? What do you think churches should do?
What should we do, Connie? Well, a few things come to mind, and it's probably I tend to start on a pretty personal level. I'm a therapist. But I tend to start with the idea of, what about observing our own reactions to stories in the church? What is our knee-jerk response when we hear that a pastor that we know, maybe not ours, but one that we know, is what bubbles up for us? Do I feel anxious? Do I feel unsettled? What am I telling myself about this? And when I want to place blame on the person bringing it up, what is that mechanism? What am I trying to protect? Because that's what that is. It's a self-protective response, a reflex. And sometimes it's so fast and instantaneous, and we've made a judgment, and we don't even realize how we got there. But I think when we hear things happening or people being accused, is to slow that video camera down a little bit and say, what's happening in me right now? Why does this cause me such anxiety to think that this might be true? Because there's reasons it causes anxiety. I mean, I don't say that uncompassionately. You and I go to the same church, Crispin, and if I found out that one of our pastors was involved, that stakes in the game for me. It's like, no, everything in me is no. Well, why is that? Why am I not thinking, whoa, who's the survivor here? How are they? What's happened? I'm saying no, because it's a personal threat to me. I don't want it to be true. It's going to unsettle my world. It's going to upset my social circle. It's going to cause division in my social circle. People taking sides. So to allow that awareness, I think, to bubble up, to say, okay, what's happening in me? And I think it's probably no shock that I love the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement. And I think this awareness is changing some things because it's starting to challenge that knee-jerk response. It's starting to challenge it and go, oh my gosh, look what I just did. Even if we want to be fair, most of us would say, I want to be fair about it. But it challenges that. And I think continuing to integrate, you say, what should we do? Continuing to integrate an awareness of the full picture, of realizing our history, of protecting power, because that's what this is. I mean, we protect power because they're the leaders. They're the ones who are keeping our community cohesive and stable. And if the power falls, then you've got... It's a personal threat again. It's a personal threat. So we tend to preserve power. We'll go toward, protect the leader of my community. And I think all these awarenesses, it's got to be at grassroots. I mean, I suppose some denominational heads, maybe maybe could make some difference. I don't trust that at this point, clearly.
Right.
I don't trust what I'm seeing denominationally in just about any way. Yeah. Theoretically, I think they could make a difference. But to me, if it's going to happen, that's further down line. I think this has to be grassroots of people standing up and saying, no, we're going to stand by this survivor in our church. We're going to listen. We're going to hear. Right. We can still be discerning, but we're going to listen, and we're not going to knee-jerk saying, why is she saying this? What's motivating her?
Right.
Which is what we tend to do.
So running with, you were talking about power, and on our podcast, we talk a lot about power, and political power. And the thing that we've been asking in this is, how does this present darkness, how did it influence not just church life, but evangelicals and how they approach the political landscape?
Oh, golly.
Right?
Yes. Oh, that's a whole other package.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
And looking at, this whole theme of like, here's a small conservative town that's under demonic attack. Right. But I wonder, thinking about that idea, this power dynamic of God has chosen the leader. And if you oppose,
you're against God and you're for Satan.
Right. Yeah. I wonder, reflecting on just like American evangelical politics, how do you see the dynamics of this abuse narrative or this power differential narrative? How do you see that playing out politically?
How many hate emails do you want to get, Crispin, with this response?
We just won't forward them on to you.
That's right. Exactly. Forward this to Connie. I was a kid when I saw evangelicals starting to consolidate power politically. I graduated in 82 from high school. So I was watching this consolidation in the pre-Reagan and the Reagan era with Jerry Falwell, moral majority. I mean, that was my era. And even before that, like Phyllis Schlafly, I don't even know if you know that name, but that's a, anti-feminist.
Yes. Yeah, I've read a little bit.
Yes. And so, I mean, all those names were ones my mom was reading the books, those books. And of course, let's just say it, James Dobson comes on the scene, and all this consolidation of power in this voting bloc. It simultaneousely breaks my heart and gets me so angry because it's ruined us. We have sold our soul for political power. And I'm not going to get specific here in this day and age, but we've sold our soul. And I was saying that before this last election cycle. And it was just in living color this last time. Right. And because evangelicals felt they were stripped of power for 8 years before that, the boomerang violent repercussions were, I just stood back and couldn't believe it, Yeah. But if you're putting demons and angels, and we need political power to fight the forces of evil, we're in deep doo-doo. Because can we go back and read the Gospels? Oh, my word.
Right.
I mean, to me, it's just so explicit. Power, Jesus didn't use what he had purposely, very intentionally. And we're supposed to be modeling that. And he didn't join the zealots. He didn't. Oh, okay. I'll just stop here.
Yeah.
So the hate mail slows down a little bit.
All our Mennonite fans will be, listeners will be really glad.
Yes. But I look at that, and it is so heartbreaking to me, because I feel like we've lost our soul in this. We've lost our personal integrity.
Definitely. Yeah. And then I wonder that power narrative of like God has chosen the anointed.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that keeps going. Mm-hmm. That keeps going on into back to the Old Testament story. We want a king desperately. And we're geared for that. I don't think that's all bad or evil, but I think it's propensity that God seemed to be putting the brakes on a little bit, saying, slow it down.
Right.
And we want power. We want a leader, a powerful leader to follow. Jesus disappointed people in that regard.
Right.
He's like, man, this isn't the power I was hoping for. So.
Yeah. I think one of the things that often comes up in that gut reaction, right, is this person has meant something to me in my own spiritual life.
Yes.
So it's beyond even familiarity, but it's like this person was really important to me in this time or that time.
Yes.
Right. And so just yesterday, I think, was when Jean Vanier, it was shown that he had abused multiple women. And I don't want to speculate too much, but I know that people with disabilities get abused at a higher rate. There's, just a lot there. What do we do with, in fact, Danielle was just talking earlier today about how a friend brought his book over today, not having heard the news, and said, this book meant so much to me.
Right, changed my life.
Right, yeah. So
and you're like, oh my gosh, it's written by a predator. You know?
Yes. I mean, for me, John Howard Yoder, speaking of Mennonites, would be another example, right? Like Christian pacifism, with his book, The Politics of Jesus, was so significant. Right. And then, you find out that he was spiritually and sexually abusing women. And then if you look at, Stanley Hauerwas, who then sort of defends him. Right. And so now you have all these men that have made significant theological contributions.
Yes.
So what do you do with their work?
Yeah. Well, I think, that's got to be individual. I think, even though I am a pretty clear, loud voice for religious abuse survivors, part of my message is the issue of spectrum. And it is the issue of black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking in this is not helpful because it's not real. It's not right. I mean, none of us are purely evil and none of us are purely good, and we all carry in this mixture. And so I feel like to look at this, I think, is it a lie that Daniel's friend had his life changed by that book? No. Do I actually think God could utilize what was written in that book? I absolutely do. As the Old Testament shows us, God can make an ass talk, so it's like, okay, whatever, Could God take that and use it for good in someone's life? Yes. I guess it's hard for me to see that couldn't happen. I think it totally could and probably has. I'm just going to say this. My mom will probably never listen to this podcast, but I'm going to say it even if she does. The man who first sexually abused me as a teenager, the pastor, it was just a few years ago. I was talking about it, and I was she was as kind of a rehearsal for one of my online courses and interviews I was doing. And she said, she knows he abused me, other people very close to us. And she said, yeah, but he was such an amazing Bible teacher. He could just teach the word. And of course, my friends were just like, later they're crawling out of their skin. Are you kidding me? I said, yes. No, I'm not. That's exactly. It's hard to reconcile. This was a person super important to her spiritual life and development. And this guy molested her daughter and other people very close to her. And it's still, but he could teach. And I thought, boy, there it is in a nutshell. It's what we do.
Yeah.
And so integrating this, Did my mom actually receive good things from the guy who abused me? Yes. I guess I don't have a hard time saying that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. But what we want to do is we want to discard one or the other. Mm-hmm. You know, she wants very much in some ways to discard what actually happened with that guy. Because he's this good man. Mm-hmm. You know, he's this man who benefited her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what do you do with their work? I think that's individual. I think you got to sort that through. Mm-hmm. What do you want to take? You know, there are some people listening to me who would probably saying, why would Connie, I went through that type of abuse. Why would I ever read anything from that author? And I go, I get that. Mm-hmm. I respect it. Mm-hmm. I have other people I'm going to respect that are going to say, and it really changed my life. And it was a real deal. For what their words, how they landed. I don't know, Chris, but what do you think? What do you think on that?
Right. It is really, I think that, I think it has a lot to do with the truth and the story that's being told, I think is really important. And yeah, I think it is sort of up individually, but I think that when you have someone like, John Howard Yoder, people have known for decades, right, that he abused women, and then to continue to venerate him, right? And I don't, that's, you know, like, how would you, I guess you could say, like, here's this, you know, really good book, and also we need to, like, mention that he, you know, did this thing.
There were some really things that were really off with who he was.
Yeah, which then makes it hard to read.
Yes.
Right? It comes back to, like...
And I think it should make it hard to read.
Yes,
It may not mean that there's no truth in it, but it should make it difficult to read.
Yeah.
And I think there's a bigger picture here of these people... I'm just going to, for lack of a better word, call it the good old boys club that says we need to continue to support these pastors. Right. I mean,
it's
Mark Driscoll is a shining example of the good old boys club, bringing him back in and getting him back on his feet within a few years of him just injuring and controlling and manipulating thousands.
Right.
And nope, the good old boys club said, nope, you're back in. You're charismatic. You're charming. You're quote great communicator. Whatever. No, you're back in. And there's a lot of systemic problem with that that where we tend to overlook.
Right.
The white male club is there going, nope, we're in control here, and we get to decide who gets to, and we're going to cover each other's butts here. And that's just explicit.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking of, right after Bill Hybels had those accusations brought against him, Bob Goff gets on stage, gives him a big hug, and that says, like, we're standing with you.
We're standing with you. We don't care about the wreckage of those survivors. We're with you. Because, again, I'm going to come back to the issue of consolidation of power.
Right. Yeah. It's true.
It's just right there. It's
Right. Yeah.
We got to keep our power right here with us. So we're going to bring you back in. We're not going to look in the face with what he did to these women. We're not going to look at them and hear their story and struggle to reconcile. Right. What does this mean? I mean, this is not, Bill Hybels did not come forward in repentance and voluntarily put this thing out there. He came forward and there was resistance and finally he got busted. So it's not like, brother, we know you're repentant, bring you back in.
Right.
You know, he got busted. Do I know whether he's repentant now? No, that's fine. But the point is, the facts are he got busted. He did not come forward. Right. I mean, I can understand a little bit more of that open-armed acceptance.
Right.
Not much, but a little bit more. But this was just explicit down the line. He did not want this public.
Right. Yeah.
He didn't want to own it.
Yeah, it's so crazy to look at. It's not crazy at all, actually, just to see how, and actually this is something that has been for my own healing, from my abuse has been understanding power dynamics and looking at like the political system and being like, yeah, that happens on all these different levels.
All these levels.
Right. And really, like, we're unwilling to hear the stories that make us uncomfortable.
Yes.
And that's, I think, kind of the heart of it. And we cling to the structures that exist and uphold them because it's more comfortable than hearing.
I mean, as a white straight woman, now I can go to bat for feminism because I get the underside of that. You know, I get what it's like to feel powerless as a woman and to not be heard and not have a voice. So I can relate to, but I'm white and straight. And so when you start talking racial power dynamics, the LGBTQ power dynamics, those stories can make me uncomfortable. Good. They need to. And I need to learn to tolerate that discomfort and to squirm and to struggle and to say, I am not the one who gets to determine their reality and their narrative. And their narrative doesn't sound real good to me. I need to sit with that. So, yeah, I mean, all the power structures politically, socially, and then you bring this, and this is what we do not talk about in the church. That's just, you know, it's almost like money. You know, no, don't talk about the money thing in church. Because this is just God's work. It's all spiritual. We also don't like talking about power. But it is everywhere. It is in every human interaction. If I go to the grocery store with a checkout lady, there is a power interaction between us. It may be extremely subtle and so superficial it's hardly noticeable, but if we boil it down, every human interaction has a power dynamic happening. And so it's gonna happen in the church. And there again, this present darkness, you know, even leveraging angels and demons is part of a power narrative. I mean, their power is greater than ours. And I'm not saying anything theologically. Don't throw Crispin hate mail about whether they exist or whether they have power. I'm just saying it is still part of that. Of how are we going to get our way? How are we going to get our story told? How are we going to get these people to do what we want them to do? And that's in church. We're not exempt. In fact, in some ways, it's a bigger deal. The power issues are. Right. So yes, you're right. On the political end, socially, it goes, and it definitely comes into church. And then God is leveraged, and then you got a whole nother power thing going on, because now I'm fighting God. If you tell me God wants me to do this, and I say no, then...
Right. Yeah, it struck me that there's no HR departments in churches.
Totally.
Right? Like other organizations are like, we're going to acknowledge that there are going to be things here.
There's power differential.
Yeah, and we need some systems and ways for people to address their concerns and people being harmed, and churches don't have those.
No, they don't. And a board or, you know, an elder team, they, you know, how we've structured it business-wise in American churches, they potentially have the capacity to be a neutralizing protective factor. I really believe they have the potential for it. I just rarely see it. I rarely see a board who is willing to take on a pastor for the sake of congregants with less power.
Right.
Because power consolidates. And the elders know to take on the pastor weakens the structure. Weakens not in a bad sense, but the parishioner who is low on the totem pole is way more expendable than the pastor. And I say that with quotes all around it. I mean, because clearly on a spiritual level they are not. In fact, they're favored according to Scripture.
Right. Yeah.
But the elder board has that option to be HR. They have that opportunity to call the pastor out and say, that was an inappropriate use of power. And you're hurting our people. Don't do that. But how often do you really hear that? Now, They might take the pastor to force because they don't like his preaching, or they don't like the carpet color, or they, the elders might turn on a pastor for that. But I have yet to see elders go toe-to-toe with the pastor for the protection of the congregants, of the people in that congregation. Maybe it happens more than I know, but I've been around a while, and I haven't seen it.
Right. Yeah.
It's more, is the pastor getting the money into the church that we need? Is he getting the sermons? Are people's needs being met? Do we have enough programs going? The elders are looking at that, or the board is looking at that. Mm-hmm. They're not saying, are our people being well taken care of and protected from a potentially abusive shepherd? Mm-hmm. So I kind of went off on that, but yes.
No, it's perfect.
But the HR that's exactly right. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, saying, oh my goodness, the elder boards have that potential to be that neutralizing factor, element. And they, due to whatever reasons, I think a lot of times comfort and consolidation of power, they don't want to.
Mm-hmm. I also think, this is just my personal experience, but having... there are multiple churches in the past where I thought about going to the elder board, not about abuse, but even just to discuss some sort of issue or concern. And I was like, that feels way too threatening to sit across the table from like 7 men.
Exactly. And you're a white male. Mm-hmm. So put that even,
Right. No, exactly. That's what I'm thinking.
Right. To you. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's crazy. And it's like, whoa, especially if there's conflict, or if you're actually have concerns about something they're doing, it's a big deal. It's gutsy to do it.
Yeah. And there's not I know for me and for many, there's not a trust that if I go to the elder board, they're going to listen. So like, even whether or not that's whatever's true, that's the perception, I think, of churches.
It is, because it's historically accurate. Right. Now, are there exceptions? Somebody write in and tell me about it. I'd love to hear it. Because I think there probably have been. But oh my gosh, I've been a pastor's wife. I've been on the mission field. I've been all over the place. And I've attended a lot of churches, served in a lot of capacities, and I've yet to hear of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where a board or elder team, or whatever we want to call them, and deacon board, whatever, that party went to bat for a less powerful member that the pastor was taking advantage of. So, Yeah.
I have one last question.
Okay, what is it?
That's been nettling away. You were talking about spectrum. Does abuse have to be intentional to be abuse?
Oh, that's one of my favorite questions. The answer to that is no. Okay. It does not have to be. I can use my power. Let's put this in the parents. I'm a parent. When I was raising my kids, I could use my power to get my needs met and hurt my kids. Did I ever do that intentionally? No. I can say that full on. Did I ever do it? You bet I did. I'm a parent. We all do it. And so I guess that's one way, because I usually trust the hearts of parents. Even if they're screwing up, they're often, most of the time, I believe they're doing the best they can with what they've got. So, and I did a pretty darn good job. And that said, I have some real regrets, because I did misuse my power. There's such a power differential between me and a little 4-year-old when I get frustrated with them, between me and my 13-year-old when they're driving me insane, even between me and my grown children, who I have to be careful. I have to be careful to remember in their neurology, we're not peers. Even though I feel like it now. I'm like, I love having them as friends. Right. Their brain still says, Mom said. And I think, okay, I have to go lightly. Okay, so use that analogy to go toward pastors. I'm going to say, I believe, well, first of all, pastors know sexual assault is wrong. They know when they're being inappropriate. So I have no what's the word? I'm not going to let them off the hook on that. Like, I didn't know.
Right. Yeah.
But the bigger issue here is abuse of power. That can show itself sexually, but it can also be psychological, financial, all those things. I think that there are a lot of well-intentioned pastors who I genuinely believe have good intentions that get screwed up in their thinking about, I need to make my congregation do this because it's what God wants. And that, in essence, is an abuse of power right there. I'm going to force and coerce and push and, do whatever to get my congregation to do what I believe God wants them to do. This is where it gets so sticky.
Right.
Why it's so messy. And so I think they're well-intentioned, but when I was able to teach at a local seminary in pastors coming up, I would push this all the time and say, do not ever forget, you're going to feel intimidated by church members. You're going to feel overwhelmed by church members. You're going to feel bullied by church members. Well, think about even with parenting. You've got younger children.
Exactly, right,
And wait till they're teens. You're going to feel bullied. You're going to feel, it's just, it happens. If they're growing up right, they're going to push back and push hard. But the issue is, the pastor still has the power in that community. And if you forget that, and if you do not handle that with utter gentleness, they're again, I'm going to refer back to Jesus. The only people he kicked their butts was the people with power. Those were the only ones he had harsh words to say. And the ones who were abusing that power. And so the rest of it's like, people were making mistakes and being silly, and he's like, okay, you have little faith, come on. But it was not, you brood of vipers, okay. That's a whole different thing.
Right.
So, and I think that's really, it shows us I believe how desperately we need to be aware of our own power. And most of us aren't. With our children, with our peers, with socially, whatever.
Right,
So back to well-intentioned. Can it be done? Yes. And I also believe there are pastors who know exactly what they're doing. So I think there's both and. But I'm going to I'll give most of them benefit of the doubt. They're trying to just find their way through in their own brokenness, like we all have, and some pastors think they don't need to deal with their brokenness. And you do. We all do. So, and because you're going to pass it along to the next person if you don't. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, to me, it's like, you bet it can be unintentional. You bet. Yeah. That said, it still does horrific damage. So I'm not taking them off the hook in that regard. Your intentions may be good. Learn, grow, change, because you are hurting people.
Well, thank you so much for talking about these wonderful topics.
Yes. Oh, we kind of went all over the place, didn't we?
Yeah. I love that we talked about, when you see those power dynamics, you just start to see it everywhere.
You do.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You kind of have to if you keep your eyes open. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
It's great to be here. I love what you guys are doing on this podcast. So thanks for having me.
Thanks. You've been listening to the Prophetic Imagination Station podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at Prophetic Imagine. You can follow me at K__Mayfield and Danielle at D_L_Mayfield. And you can email us at propheticimaginationsstation@gmail.com. You can support this podcast and get access to our Patreon-only podcast at patreon.com/DLMayfield.